On the morning of June 6, 1944, a fundamental physical contradiction appeared on the coast of Normandy. At a 5-mile stretch of sand, codenamed Omaha, the United States Army encountered a geometric nightmare. The German Atlantic Wall functioned exactly as designed. Thousands of American soldiers were pinned behind a low stone shingle, unable to move forward because the obstacles in front of them, massive steel hedgehogs, deep minefields and reinforced concrete pillboxes, required a sequence of manual demolitions that were impossible to perform under sustained machine gun fire. At Omaha, the invasion was not a maneuver, it was a stationary slaughter. Nevertheless, 15 miles to the east, on the beaches codenamed Gold, Juno and Sword, the physical reality of the war looked entirely different. Observers noted an almost industrial pace to the landings conducted by British and Canadian forces. Despite facing the same rising tide, the same minefields, and the same concrete fortifications, the infantry did not spend hours trapped in the surf. Instead, the obstacles that paralyzed Omaha seemed to dissolve. Concrete walls that should have withstood hours of shelling were collapsing in minutes. Minefields that should have required teams of engineers with handheld detectors were being cleared at a walking pace. The difference was not a matter of courage or a disparity in the volume of naval bombardment. The records indicate that the primary variable was the presence of a specific physical artifact, or rather, a collection of them. Scattered across the British sectors were vehicles that defied the established silhouette of 20th century warfare. There were tanks carrying massive rotating drums of heavy chains. There were tanks towing 6-ton armored trailers filled with pressurized nitrogen and fuel. There were tanks with no turrets at all, carrying rolls of reinforced canvas matting nearly 10 feet wide. The American command had been offered these machines months prior. They had looked at the schematics, observed the prototypes, and issued a definitive rejection. To the traditionalists in the Pentagon, these were not weapons of war. They were Hobart's Funnies, a collection of mechanical absurdities that were viewed as a distraction from the brute force doctrine of the United States military. Nevertheless, by 0800 hours on D-Day, the Funnies were no longer a joke. They were the only thing moving. The divergence between the beaches raises a question that the casualty reports would eventually make unavoidable. It was not a question of who had the most power, but who understood the geometry of the obstacle. The failure at Omaha was not a failure of will, but a failure to recognize that the Atlantic Wall was not a battlefield. It was an engineering problem. The existence of these machines was not the result of a sudden burst of inspiration, but the byproduct of a catastrophic failure 2 years prior. On August 19, 1942, the Allies launched Operation Jubilee, a large-scale raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was designed to test the feasibility of seizing a defended harbour. The result was a definitive tactical collapse. Within hours, nearly 4,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The physical evidence left on the Dieppe shoreline provided a grim diagnostic report. The primary heavy weapon of the raid, the Churchill tank, had been rendered useless by geology. The beach was composed of chert, smooth, rounded stones that offered no traction. As the tanks attempted to climb the slight incline toward the town, their tracks simply spun, digging graves into the loose stones. Those that reached the promenade found themselves halted by concrete seawalls that were 4 feet thick. The military establishment looked at the ruins of Dieppe and reached a conclusion. A frontal assault on a fortified beach was a technical impossibility. Nevertheless, one man viewed the wreckage through a different lens. Major General Percy Hobart did not see a failure of the tank. He saw a failure of the tool. Hobart was an officer whose career had been defined by friction with his superiors. Despite being one of the world's leading experts in armored warfare, his insistence on radical specialization had led to his forced retirement in 1940. He was discovered working as a corporal in the Home Guard, spending his nights patrolling a local village with a rifle. Furthermore, it took the personal intervention of Winston Churchill to retrieve Hobart from obscurity. Churchill recognized that the Atlantic Wall, a 2,000-mile system of steel and concrete, could not be broken by standard infantry tactics. He tasked Hobart with forming the 79th Armored Division. It was a unit with no traditional combat role. It was instead a laboratory. Hobart's insight was centered on a single realization. The invasion of Europe was not a series of battles, but a series of locks that needed keys. A minefield is a lock. A seawall is a lock. A reinforced bunker is a lock. To use a standard tank to solve these problems was like using a sledgehammer to open a vault. It was loud, but fundamentally ineffective. The 79th Armoured Division became known as the Zoo. Hobart gathered engineers, mechanics, and eccentric designers to modify the Churchill and Sherman chassis into highly specific instruments. Despite the mockery from traditionalists who viewed these modifications as toys, Hobart began to strip the tanks of their general-purpose utility to give them singular, overwhelming capabilities. By 1944, Hobart had developed a fleet of vehicles that looked nothing like the machines that had failed at Dieppe. Nevertheless, as the plans for D-Day finalized, a new obstacle appeared, not on the French coast, but in the minds of the Allied High Command. The British had the keys, but the Americans were not yet convinced that a lock even existed. The most significant physical barrier to an invading force is not the open beach, but the reinforced concrete pillbox. On the Atlantic Wall, German engineers had perfected the flanking fire design. These bunkers faced down the length of the beach. This meant that as infantry landed, they were caught in a crossfire from positions that were virtually immune to frontal small arms fire and naval shelling. The British solution to this specific architectural problem was an artifact of extreme mechanical brutality: the Churchill Crocodile. At first glance, the Crocodile appeared to be a standard Churchill heavy tank. Nevertheless, a closer inspection revealed a fundamental change in its internal anatomy. The hull machine gun had been removed and replaced with a flame projector. Furthermore, the tank was permanently tethered to a 6.5-ton armoured trailer by a specialised articulated link. This trailer carried 400 imperial gallons, roughly 1,800 litres, of a thickened fuel known as fraz. It was not a liquid in the traditional sense. It was a pressurised gel, a substance with the consistency of heavy syrup designed to stick to vertical surfaces. 5 cylinders of compressed nitrogen sat inside the trailer, providing the force necessary to propel this gel through a pipe running beneath the tank's chassis. The sound of the weapon was as much a part of its utility as the heat. When the nozzle opened, the release of the nitrogen propellant created a deafening, low-frequency roar. The fuel was pressurized to such an extreme that it launched a 120-meter lance of liquid fire. This was a terrifying, incandescent geometry that instantly vaporized the notion of cover. The physics of the Crocodile defied the limitations of previous man-portable flamethrowers. While a soldier with a backpack unit might reach 20 meters, the Crocodile's reach allowed it to stay outside the effective range of German hand grenades and light anti-tank weapons. Despite the terrifying visual of the flame, its primary effectiveness was not combustion, but the consumption of oxygen and the manipulation of fluids. The fuel was designed to blob, to strike a bunker's narrow observation slit and flow inside like molten lava. When a Crocodile engaged a target, it did not rely on a lucky hit. It possessed enough fuel for 81-second bursts or a continuous stream lasting over a minute. This volume of fire created a vacuum effect within enclosed fortifications. Carbon monoxide replaced breathable air in seconds. The smell, a thick, cloying mixture of burning diesel and chemical thickening agents, would permeate the concrete long before the temperature became lethal. Furthermore, the psychological weight of the machine was often more effective than the fire itself. The sight of the armoured trailer snaking behind the tank signalled to German defenders that their concrete walls had become an oven. On Gold Beach, the impact was immediate. Records show that in several sectors, the mere arrival of a Crocodile, even before the ignition of the projector, prompted the immediate surrender of German strongpoints. The Funny had turned the most formidable defence on the coast into a liability. Nevertheless, the Crocodile addressed only the visible threat. Beneath the sand lay a hidden obstacle that required a different kind of violence, one that did not use heat, but sheer rhythmic impact. The second layer of the Atlantic Wall was invisible. For years, the German military had seeded the French coastline with millions of telemines and S-mines, creating a subterranean landscape where a single misplaced footstep could halt an entire company. Traditional mine clearing relied on a soldier with a metal detector and a bayonet, a process that was slow, precise, and fatal under fire. The solution to this stalemate was the Sherman crab. It was a design that prioritized mechanical aggression over manual precision. The crab was defined by a massive steel drum mounted on two long arms extending from the front of the tank. Attached to this drum were 43 heavy steel chains, each ending in a fist-sized steel ball. To a casual observer, it looked like a prehistoric agricultural tool. However, the engineering was a masterpiece of kinetic energy. The drum was powered by the tank's own engine, geared to spin at a constant 142 RPM. As the tank moved forward at a slow crawl, the chains whipped. The tips of the flails struck the sand with such immense force that they simulated the weight of a heavy vehicle. The goal was not to remove the mines, but to force them to function. Each chain strike triggered the pressure-sensitive detonators, causing the mines to explode harmlessly beneath the flail. The sensory experience of a crab in action was a study in sensory overload. For the British infantry following behind, the sound was deafening, punctuated by the sharp cracks of detonating mines and the metallic scream of the drum's drive chain. The air was filled with a constant cloud of pulverized sand, salt spray, and smoke. Despite the chaos, the crab was a machine of extreme precision. It cleared a path exactly 9 feet 11 inches wide, just enough for the tracks of the tanks following in its wake. Hobart's engineers had chosen the flail over the more traditional mine plough for a specific structural reason. A plough might push a mine aside, leaving it active for a soldier stepping off the path. The flail ensured total destruction. But the flails did more than clear explosives. The spinning chains were equally effective at shredding the tanglefoot barbed wire obstacles that snagged infantry uniforms and slowed the advance. Similarly, the crab was equipped with a secondary system to mark its progress. As it moved, it dispensed powdered chalk or white tape from bins at the rear, creating a visible, safe lane through the grey smoke of the beach. For a soldier landing on Sword Beach, that white line was the difference between life and a catastrophic loss of limb. Despite the crab's effectiveness, it remained a target. To work, it had to move slowly, making it a stationary mark for the heavy anti-tank guns positioned in the dunes. To silence those guns and the concrete walls that housed them, Hobart needed a weapon that moved beyond fire and chains, a weapon designed for pure, concussive demolition. The divergence in the casualty rates of D-Day began months earlier in the briefing rooms of the Allied High Command. Major General Percy Hobart had offered the full suite of his 79th Armored Division to the American forces. He had provided live demonstrations showing how the crab could walk through a minefield and how the AVRE could dismantle a wall. However, the American response was one of definitive skepticism. General Omar Bradley and his staff viewed the Funnies as a distraction. To the American military mind of 1944, the tank was a weapon of maneuver and speed. Hobart's machines, burdened by 6-ton trailers or heavy rotating drums, were seen as lumbering targets. The American command dismissed the collection as funny, using the word as a synonym for unreliable and fringe. Correspondingly, there was a prevailing belief that specialization was a waste of resources. The American logistical machine was built on the principle of the standardized part. They wanted one tank, the M4 Sherman, to do everything. Adding a dozen variants with specialized hydraulic systems and unique ammunition was viewed as a nightmare for the supply chain. One senior American officer famously summarized the sentiment, dismissing the specialized vehicles as a waste of resources that would only clutter the beach and slow down the real fighting. The rejection was anchored in a specific kind of strategic hubris. General Bradley expressed a deep confidence in the existing American doctrine, the belief that massive pre-invasion naval bombardment and the sheer volume of standard armor would be enough to suppress any defense. Bradley's stance was that the American infantrymen, supported by the standard Sherman, didn't need gimmicks. He believed that brute force, applied with enough intensity, would render Hobart's engineering solutions redundant. Despite the British commander's warnings that the Atlantic Wall was not a tactical problem but a structural one, the Americans accepted only one of Hobart's designs, the DD duplex drive swimming tank. They chose the tool that helped them reach the beach, but rejected every tool designed to help them clear it. The American command had decided to bet the lives of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions on the idea that the door-knocker guns of the Germans would be silenced by the Navy. They assumed the minefields would be manageable and the sea walls would be shattered by the time the ramps dropped. And, as the sun rose over Omaha Beach, the American soldiers realized that the naval shells had missed their marks. The obstacles remained. The standard tanks were sinking, and the funny machines they had ridiculed were exactly what they needed to survive. At 6:30 hours, the theoretical debate between British engineering and American doctrine was subjected to a cold, physical trial. The result was a split-screen narrative of survival and stagnation. On Omaha Beach, the American plan disintegrated almost immediately. The standard DD tanks, the only funnies the Americans had accepted, were launched too far out in heavy seas. Of the 29 tanks launched by the 741st Tank Battalion, 27 sank instantly, taking their crews to the bottom of the channel. Without the specialized crabs to clear paths or AVREs to crack the seawall, the infantry of the 1st and 29th Divisions were funneled into killing zones. They were pinned against a shingle bank, facing a German defense that was entirely intact. The obstacles they had dismissed as manageable became a physical wall that held them in place for hours of sustained slaughter. 15 miles to the east, the zoo was at work. At Gold Beach, the crabs of the Westminster Dragoons landed in the first wave. Despite the heavy surf, they did not sink. They crawled onto the sand and immediately began the destruction of the minefields. And while the American infantry was being torn apart trying to cut barbed wire by hand, the British infantry walked through gaps shredded by the spinning chains of the crabs. The contrast was most visible at the strong points. At Omaha, a single concrete bunker could hold up an entire regiment for 4 hours. At Juno and Sword, the arrival of a single Churchill AVRE changed the timeline of the battle. One British veteran later recalled the sight. "We were held up by a massive concrete wall. Then this strange-looking tank with a short, fat gun crawled up. There was a tremendous crump, a cloud of dust, and when the air cleared, the wall was simply gone. We just walked through." Despite the chaos of the landing, the British and Canadian sectors operated with unusual rhythm. The specialized tools were meeting the specialized obstacles. The result was a advance that reached its inland objectives hours ahead of the American forces. On the British beaches, the question was not if they would break through, but how fast. On Omaha, the question was whether the invasion would have to be abandoned entirely. As the morning progressed, the survivors at Omaha could see the cost of their command's skepticism in the rising tide. The obstacles that should have been cleared by Hobart's toys were now being submerged, turning the beach into a graveyard of tangled steel and drowning men. The success of the British beaches wasn't just due to the tanks that cleared the way, it was also due to the machines that ensured the way stayed open. While the crocodile and the crab captured the attention of frontline observers, the momentum of the invasion relied on two even more specialized machines. These were vehicles of pure logistical necessity. They solved the two most basic physical constraints of the Normandy coast, the instability of the ground and the height of the sea walls. The first of these was the Churchill bobbin. It was a response to the Dieppe problem, the terrifying reality that a multi-ton tank would simply vanish into soft blue clay or loose shingle. The bobbin was essentially a mobile road builder. It carried a massive horizontal drum at the front, wrapped with a 9-foot 11-inch wide roll of wire-reinforced canvas matting. As the tank moved forward, it unspooled this carpet beneath its own tracks. The weight of the vehicle pressed the matting into the mud, creating a temporary, reinforced roadway. Consequently, the tanks and trucks that followed did not sink into the mire. They had a stable, high-friction surface that allowed them to exit the beach and reach the paved roads inland. Without this simple canvas bridge, the British sectors would have suffered the same bottleneck effect that paralyzed Omaha, where vehicles became stuck in the sand and served as stationary targets for German artillery. In addition to the bobbin, Hobart introduced the Churchill Ark, armoured ramp carrier. This vehicle was perhaps the most radical departure from traditional tank design. The turret was removed entirely. In its place, the engineers fitted two massive folding ramps, one at the front and one at the rear. The Ark did not fight. It sacrificed itself. Its purpose was to bridge anti-tank ditches or to allow other vehicles to scale seawalls that were too steep to climb. The driver would navigate the Ark directly into a ditch or up against a wall and deploy the ramps. The result was a self-propelled bridge 8.9 meters long and 3.0 meters wide. Other tanks would then simply drive over the Ark to reach the objective. This self-sacrifice maintained the velocity of the attack. On the British beaches, the presence of the Ark meant that an anti-tank ditch was only a 60-second delay rather than a terminal halt. Conversely, on the American beaches, every such obstacle required a team of engineers to manually place explosives or fill the gap with dirt under a hail of bullets. The arcs and bobbins were the silent Funnies. They did not produce the dramatic pyrotechnics of the crocodile, yet they provided the structural foundation for the entire breakout. Regardless of the skepticism from high-ranking generals, the physical evidence on the sand was irrefutable. The British were off the beach, and the Americans were still fighting for every inch of it. When the smoke cleared on the evening of June 6th, the theoretical debate over Hobart's zoo was replaced by a grim statistical reality. The invasion was a success, but the cost of that success was distributed with startling inequality. The casualty figures provided the final, irrefutable proof that the funny tanks were not a waste of resources. They were a life-saving necessity. The numbers tell a story of two different wars fought on the same day. At Omaha Beach, where the American command had relied on standard doctrine and brute force, the casualty list was staggering. The records indicate between 2,400 and 3,600 casualties in a single day. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were nearly bled white, held in place by obstacles that remained functional for hours. At Omaha, the geometry of the solution was absent. In contrast, the British and Canadian sectors, Gold, Juno and Sword, faced German defences of similar density and quality. On Gold Beach, where the Funnies were deployed most extensively, casualties were approximately 1,100. On Juno, despite a particularly difficult landing, the count was roughly 961. On Sword Beach, the number dropped even further to approximately 683. Looking at the data side by side, the disparity is impossible to ignore. On the British beaches, the specialised tanks acted as a shield for the infantry. Every mine detonated by a crab was a life saved. Every bunker silenced by a crocodile or an AVRE meant 100 men didn't have to charge a machine gun nest with nothing but a rifle. The American command had prioritised versatility, wanting a tank that could do everything decently. The British had prioritised specialisation, wanting a tank that could do one impossible thing perfectly. Consequently, the British infantry were able to move past the shoreline and into the green fields beyond within hours of landing. Conversely, on Omaha, the survivors were still huddling at the base of the cliffs, exhausted and disorganized. This statistical execution demonstrates that the most expensive weapon in the war was not the specialized tank, but the standard soldier tasked with doing a machine's job. The British had paid in steel and hydraulics. The Americans had paid in blood. The aftermath of D-Day forced a radical reassessment within the American First Army. The skepticism that had defined the pre-invasion planning vanished as the after-action reports reached General Bradley's headquarters. They were filled with the physical descriptions of obstacles that had proved immune to standard high-velocity shells. The American command had initially viewed specialization as a logistical burden. Nevertheless, by July 1944, they were actively requesting the very gimmicks they had ridiculed in May. The realization was driven by the bocage, the dense, ancient hedgerows of Normandy that acted as natural fortifications for German anti-tank teams. Standard Shermans were being knocked out as they attempted to climb over these banks, exposing their thin belly armor to the enemy. In a desperate reversal of dogma, the Americans began an improvised engineering program of their own. They took the scrap steel from German beach obstacles, the Rommel's asparagus, and welded them to the front of tanks to create rhino cutters. This was, in essence, a field expedient funny. Furthermore, they began to integrate British crabs and crocodiles into their own armoured columns whenever Hobart could spare them. The strategic impact of this shift was a belated validation of Hobart's central thesis. The American command had been forced to learn that power is not a substitute for precision. Despite their vast industrial capacity, they had entered the continent with the wrong tools for the specific geography of the Atlantic Wall. This post-mortem revealed a classic failure of military dogma. The focus on standardization had created a blind spot. The Americans had assumed that the battle would be won by the volume of fire, but D-Day proved it was won by the nature of the delivery system. Hobart's zoo had not been a collection of toys. It was a catalogue of solutions for a set of problems the Americans hadn't even admitted existed until the casualty lists made them undeniable. The funny tanks had saved D-Day, but they had also rewritten the rules of modern combined arms warfare. The age of the general-purpose tank was momentarily eclipsed by the era of the specialized machine. The story of the Funnies is often relegated to the footnotes of military history as a collection of eccentric curiosities. Nevertheless, when the mechanical layers of the D-Day landings are stripped away, a deeper truth about the nature of innovation remains. Major General Percy Hobart did not simply build strange tanks, he challenged the institutional belief that brute force is the only currency of war. The legacy of these machines is found in the physical geometry of modern combat engineering. Today, every major military in the world employs specialized variants of the funny tanks. We see their direct descendants in the armored bridge layers that span rivers in minutes and the remote-controlled flail systems that clear minefields in modern conflict zones. The zoo was the blueprint for the contemporary belief that every obstacle has a specific, engineered solution. Additionally, the vindication of Hobart's vision serves as a reminder of the cost of skepticism. The thousands of men who walked off the British beaches in the afternoon of June 6th owed their lives to a man who was once told his ideas were a waste of resources. Despite being ridiculed by the architects of the invasion, Hobart's machines proved that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the courage to be clever. The artifacts left behind, the rusted tracks of an aviary or the charred nozzle of a crocodile, are tangible proof of an engineering doctrine that prioritized the preservation of life over the purity of tradition. They remind us that the Atlantic Wall was not broken by the weight of the shells that hit it, but by the ingenuity of the tools that dismantled it piece by piece. The Funnies were never a joke. They were the key to a continent. And as the tide rose over the wreckage of Omaha, the silence of the German guns in the British sectors stood as a final, wordless testament to the man who dared to look at a tank and see a scalpel.